Good day, everyone, and welcome to the Brussels School of International Studies book talk, which is our pandemic era adjustment of our regular guest lecture series. Today, we are here to discuss a very compelling polemic by our Canterbury colleague, Dr. Philip Cunliffe. The book is called The New 20 Years Crisis, a critique of contemporary international relations, 1999-2019, and it's been published by McGill-Queen's University Press last year. Together with the author and with myself, I'm Maria Mälksoo. I'm in charge of the guest lecture series and now the book talks of BSIS here at the University of Kent in Brussels. With us here is today also Professor Lucian Ashworth, who is joining us early in the morning from the Memorial University of Newfoundland in Canada. I shall introduce our conversationalists briefly, and then we shall get going, because there is, as you can imagine, a lot to discuss and a lot to take up with this interesting book. So let me start with our author of the day. Philip Cunliffe is senior lecturer in politics and international relations at the University of Kent, which he joined in 2009. And he, I think, shares a thing or two with E.H. Carr, whose original 20 Years Crisis has very much provided the template to engage with for the book that we are discussing today. Also in terms of the wide variety of your interests and public engagement, I believe. Philip has written widely on a series of political issues ranging from Balkan politics, the Russian Revolution to Brexit, but with a particular focus on the international efforts to manage violent conflict since the end of the Cold War. So he's written a thing or two about the new liberal way of war and sovereignty and peacekeeping and peacekeepers. And I should also mention that the year 2020, which many of us, I think, would think was for many good reasons an annus horribilis, was in many ways an annus mirabilis for Phil, because he published not just this book that we are discussing today, but in fact 2 books. So the other book, which we might maybe touch upon if we have time on the fringes, but probably we'll have to reserve for another show, is called Cosmopolitan Dystopia, International Intervention and the Failure of the West, at Manchester University Press. Welcome, Phil, and welcome, Luke. Professor Lucian Ashworth is the current head of the Department of Political Science at the Memorial University of Newfoundland, and he works in the history of international political thought, and like Phil, is of course the author of many books and numerous papers in journals and edited volumes, with a particular expertise in his case in interwar international relations and intellectual history. So we are very much looking forward to your engagement with this part of Philip's argument there. And before I will hand it over to Phil, let me just remind everyone that since this is a webinar, you are of course most welcome, from the get-go to pose your questions in the Q&A box. You can't say them out loud. You have to write them in the Q&A box, and then you can start typing as soon as the questions emerge, and I will pick them up as we go on. And perhaps I should also remind you of something that you already saw on the first slide. There is a nice 20% discount that the publisher of Phil's book is offering on the event, so you can follow up with this quote and order the book for yourself after the event. But without further ado, let me start us off, Phil, with the basic rundown of the book's argument. Perhaps you can also tell us a little bit what really compelled you to write this book in the first place. Was there sort of longer brewing sense of disagreement and this sort of content with how things were going in international relations as an empirical reality and international relations theory as the field that tries to make sense of that reality? Or was there some very specific impetus that pushed you there?
Thank you, Maria. And before I begin, I'd just like to extend my thanks to the Brussels School of International Studies for hosting us today, to Maria for setting it up and for leading and moderating. And thanks also to Luke for joining us so bright and early from Canada. And also a big thank you to Tanya, the moderator, who's been so efficient and effective in putting the whole thing together. I genuinely appreciate the opportunity, and in these circumstances I think it's more important than ever that we try to maintain these threads of social connectivity and try to continue our job as scholars and academics to have these kinds of discussions. So I do appreciate everything around this talk. So in response to Maria's kind introduction, the book was motivated by a brewing sense of dissatisfaction that had been kind of bubbling for some time, and also with my dissatisfaction not only with the, as you say, the kind of the actual state of the international order, but also with the ways in which we try to understand it, the study of the academic study of international politics, international studies or international relations, and a deep frustration with what I felt was its obliviousness in many ways to the portents of what was coming, and then the unexpectedly visceral and in some respects even unhinged reaction to the shock of what happened in 2016 with the Britain's secession vote to secede from the European Union, and then with the election of Donald Trump as president. Despite the fact that it seemed to me that there were portents of a dramatic shift in international politics. And I felt that my discipline had been insufficiently prepared for this, even though we really should have been prepared for it, given the fact that so many of the problems, I think, that were coming were visible in how the Iraq War played out in 2003. So while the problems that we're dealing with are all, to a greater or lesser extent, I think, the backwash of the 2008 financial crisis, I think that some of the grounds of that were laid in 2003, and some of the politics that we would see later were also laid in 2003. So in some respects, I think international relations as a discipline should have been further ahead than our respective colleagues in economics and political science. And the fact that we weren't was a source of frustration for me. So in writing the book, I wanted to take responsibility as much as I can as an individual for the discipline. It is as much, it's not only a criticism of the discipline, but a collective, it's also to some extent self-critique as well. It's a collective criticism, I think, of our shortcomings and failures to address the political problems of the world, and that we've made that worse for ourselves by the kinds of intellectual frameworks and theoretical frameworks that we've chosen, and that tend to reinforce the existing, tend to kind of obfuscate, mystify, and reinforce existing power structures, rather than to really help us understand their dynamics and how they might be shifting. So to that hopefully gives some indication of the some of the impetus behind writing the book. In terms of if I do my best to provide an overview of the argument, the book is obviously addressed to our contemporary problems with liberal international order. We seem to be going, I mean, this is uncontroversial to say, we seem to be going through a cycle of fragmentation and decline of liberal international order. It is much discussed, much commented upon, not only in international relations as the discipline, but in the wider political world, and we seem to be living with the consequences of that. However, much of this discussion focuses on the US. and much of it is surrounds, say, the failures of US grand strategy, the US shift of attention from Europe to East Asia, the failure of US nation building programs, the fact that the US is mired in the so-called forever wars in the aftermath of the war on terror, still in Afghanistan, Iraq and Libya to greater or lesser extents, still bombing Somalia, and still militarily involved in Syria as well. So most of these discussions of liberal international order tend to be very US focused, and particularly those who are critical of liberal international order, US realists and those who participate in the debates on grand strategy, they tend to focus on US foreign policy and the failures of US foreign policy. And while obviously the US is at the core of our international order, and therefore there is no avoiding discussion of the US, I did want to broaden the debate beyond a critique of US foreign policy. I wanted to integrate, to bring international relations to bear on the European Union, which seemed to me very much an artifact of the liberal international order, and to provide a wider lens to understand the dynamics of international relations as a scholarly endeavor, as an intellectual enterprise that went beyond just liberal international theories, but also to take aim at critical and constructivist international theories, or critical theories for shorthand, as I refer to them in the book, because I think they also embodied many of the fallacies of liberal internationalism as an approach to international order. So what was striking to me was the complete absence of Carr from this debate. So with one or two exceptions, one or two honorable exceptions, including Luke and some others, generally Carr was very much absent from these debates, and it was peculiar to me. So in one of these discussions critiquing liberal international order by John G. Mearsheimer, the kind of granddaddy of realism in the US, he explicitly puts Carr to one side and says, I'm not going to be using Carr. And it was bizarre to me, not only because the scholarship on Carr has improved recently so much, but also that the parallels were so striking. I mean, you know, like reading, often when I reopened my copy of the 20 Years Crisis and was looking at all my kind of naive marginal notes from when I was an undergraduate, what leapt out at me was how many of the examples he gives, how many of the points he makes just seem to be, could have easily been describing events that were in the early 2000s, in the mid 2000s, around the economic crisis. So it was remarkable to me that there'd been no attempt at a systematic comparison of the decline and fragmentation of our own liberal international order with the paradigmatic decline and fall story of liberal international order, which is the interwar order, 1919 to 1939, and which was penned by E.H. Carr in his 20 Years Crisis. So Carr's claims about liberal utopianism is at the core of the book. And from my point of view, I think that a new kind of liberal utopianism is deeply entrenched, particularly in critical theories today. And with this, I think they, as I've already indicated, they express and reinforce a particular model of unipolar globalization that seems to be receding into the past. And the fact that we've seen such little adaptation, intellectual, theoretical adaptation to these political changes, means that it's that much more difficult to track what's actually happening. And so this requires us to break down these frameworks that we've inherited and to try and construct something new. And that is part of what I try to do in the book. So to try and to briefly kind of indicate what I think the connection is between these new set of theories, critical theories that emerge in the wake of the Cold War, and the structure of the post-Cold War order. What was most striking about all of these theories that emerged in the wake of the Cold War was their emphasis on agency, on contingency, on identity, on flexibility, on the plasticity of the social world, and by extension, international politics. And I think this was the kind of the chief characteristic of many of these theories to emerge in the post-Cold War era. And what was striking about this to me was that it seemed that this expressed the kind of effectively all the common thread in all of these theories. What they really expressed was the kind of the freewheeling nature of unipolarity. That in fact, what they really, in all of their emphasis on the adaptability and the changeability of the post-Cold War order, what they were really expressing was a conceit of unipolarity. Just to say, they expressed a particular type of distribution of power and a particular structure of the international order. And that this is very much the way in which the US understood international order to be, that it could be radically remolded, that the US could use its power, its appeal, its tremendous range of institutions which it controls to a greater or lesser degree, and that it would be joined by its allies, and that it would be able to remold the international order in its path, with democratization, with liberalization, with human rights, with new models of economic transformation, with neoliberal economic programs. And so all of this emphasis on agency and flexibility and the rest of it, all they did, in fact, to me, it seems that it was, in fact, what they were expressing was this newfound impetus, the new field that was open to US power, the limitless character, effectively, of US power in the post-Cold War period. And effectively what this amounted to was a recreation of some of the most basic themes of what Carr called liberal utopianism in the interwar period, and particularly this idea of the harmony of interests. So what Carr criticized in the interwar period was this idea that underlying all political disputes was this essential convergence of all interests throughout the world, and that all political disagreement was essentially friction that would pass in due course because everyone was essentially aligned and on side. And that this effectively, it seemed to me that this idea, which he castigated in the interwar period, and he said it was inhibited the possibility of political change because everyone wasn't able to understand or process and respond to what their actual interests were, because political interest, the differences of political interest were genuine and deep, and nobody was willing to accept this openly or to engage with those political differences, that we've effectively did the same thing in IR, that we fell into the trap of recreating a model of a harmony of interests. But rather than taking it from the 19th century liberal economics, as people did in the interwar period, we did it through critical theory and constructivism. We assumed that everyone could be reshaped in a similar mold. That through the power of discourse, that through the power of the transformation of identity, through the agency, through the plasticity of international politics, that essentially everyone would be harmonized in due course. And again, for all the kind of the penumbra of radicalism that was attached to these theories, it seemed to me that they were reinforcing very basic liberal tropes. And that they expressed, again, that central limitless character of US power, the fact there was no external check on US power, that the US effectively was in a position of tremendous domination in the aftermath of the Cold War. So the basic claim that I put across is this is the core of the critique that I try to advance, and I make the contention that we need to use Carr's optics, and that all claims about international politics and international theory need to be rigorously re-examined through the lens of power political competition. And that's one of the core lessons from Carr, and which we failed to do. So to understand politics, international politics, as one of its core components being a struggle for power and the dynamic of state interest and state competition. And this is something that was easy to forget when the US ruled the roost unchallenged. It's becoming something which is more difficult to avoid given the rise of China and greater contestation with Russia and the limits of US power that are so clearly visible at the end of our 20-year crisis. But that this needs to be more systematically threaded through all of the superstructure of international relations theory. And this is something that so far we failed to do. We've ended up, I think, with critical theory, we've ended up expressing deeply naive approaches to international politics. And the model of critical theory, or the slogan, I think, is most clearly expressed in Robert Cox's notion. He said, all theory has a purpose. All theory is for some purpose. And he had a very particular intention to draw, he wanted to draw attention to the power political aspects of international theory. And in fact, what we've ended up doing instead is people will say, when they use critical theory in the Coxian vein, they'll say, well, you know, if all theory is for some purpose, my purposes are good, and my purposes are just. And therefore, I don't need to attend to the questions of power politics, and I don't need to consider my own relationship to these underlying dynamics of power political contestation. And so through this kind of naivety that was reintroduced into the study of international politics by critical theory, by the conceit of different strands of critical theory, we've ended up in effectively with a new version of liberal utopianism. And I think it's entirely merited to use the theoretical weapons, as Carr calls them, to razor apart some of these claims, and that's what I try to do. I don't want to say that's the entirety of what our analysis of international politics should consist of, but it is a vital prerequisite of any international analysis of international politics that is that wants to be taken seriously. And I've already overran a bit, but just to, I suppose, if I could just prevail on everyone's patience and just take an extra moment to wrap up, if I may, Maria. So I'll finish by saying this. So I suppose the utility of Carr is not only how many similarities there are that he allows us to, his critique of liberalism, it's still so useful to us today, but it's also the things that he got wrong are also just as interesting and useful and productive to think with in our contemporary context. And what's most striking is that he expected liberal international order to completely disintegrate and be replaced by a new kind of order entirely dominated by great powers in the aftermath of the Second World War. And as it ended up, we got something of a hybrid with some elements of that new great power dominated order did emerge, but it also was a liberal international order recreated. So the question is, why does liberal international order, why do we keep on recreating it, given the fact that it seems prone to these repetitive cycles of fragmentation and decline? And I think that is also worth thinking through. I would hazard to say that the 20 years crisis, that fragmentation and decline is built into the functioning of liberal international order itself. So that our institutions, the practices, the policies, and the politics of liberal international order is legitimated by this constant teetering on the precipice of decline and cataclysm. And so this is partly the way in which liberal politics justifies itself today, that any alternative to liberal politics, to liberal international order, will inevitably lead to some cataclysm. And this politics of fear, I think we have to now that we're deep into the fairly deep already into the 21st century, we need to break past it. We can't allow ourselves to be afraid of political change with the notion that we're condemned to repeat the 20th century. So that would be, that's where I think we need to break past, not only to use the analysis of the 20 years crisis to understand the contemporary context, but also to break through the 20 years crisis and to stop being afraid that the end of liberal international order necessarily means fascism and war and genocide and all the terrible cataclysms of the 20th century. We need to be willing to be bolder, I think. If we're genuinely to be in a position to improve our political lives. And given the very fact that we're talking like this in circumstances that are so difficult and beyond our control, and given everything that's happened with the pandemic, I would think the need for fundamental improvement to our collective political life would be very obvious. Anyway, thank you for your attention and patience, and I look forward to hearing what everyone has to say.
Thanks very much, Phil. And I think your sort of final point about how Carr, in a way, sees us as, destined to basically oscillate between this utopianism and what he calls prudent realism. one necessarily correcting the other over time. I think this is also a good point to turn it over to Luke, because you yourself engaged with a paradox. In a way, you do not agree with the fact that we necessarily have to sort of, work in between these two pulling and pushing forces, and yet there is no way to also pass a car or leave it to history. So Luke, I'd like to bring you in with your take on, do you recognize Carr, and did you have a deja vu of the original 20 Years Crisis when you read the new 20 Years Crisis by Phil?
Yes, I did, and I'll come on to that as well. And I mean, because this is a debate, what I'm going to concentrate on. So it's a bit like if we were doing a PhD defense in a way. So it's a sort of a second PhD defense for Phil. Is of course I'm going to concentrate on the weaknesses, right, when I'm discussing this. But I want to preface that first by I think bringing out the strengths, but I think also bringing out the importance of people like Phil within debates within international relations. And what I often find, I mean, Phil writes very well. And I think also, Phil, what I like about you as well, I mean, I hope you won't be insulted on this, but I see you very much as a kind of a gadfly, in a way, within international relations. And, when I'm reading your stuff, my usual reaction as you go through is, I'm sure that's not right. No, that's not right. But that's interesting. But that's not right. But that's interesting. And by the time I get to the end, I've collected together all of those that's interesting points. And that's always the value of your work, is that it's kind of pushing me always to kind of rethink and to be better at what I do. So very much that sort of vision of the Socratic gadfly. So I think in that sense, Phil, your work's really important to IR. And I suppose there's an irony here that, of course, in your criticism of IR, that also you are coming from IR in many respects, and so in some respects you refute your own point by, of course, showing that actually IR has these different perspectives, because you're one of them, and you're very much part of our community. So I think it's this is a really interesting and valuable book. Maria, you described it as a polemic, and of course 20 Years Crisis is also a polemic. And I think what that Phil does very well is bringing out again that kind of that Carrian analysis that we saw, not in his other works, because he's a very multifaceted thinker, but definitely within the 20 Years Crisis, that this is very much fitting into that mold. So it's like Carr, and it has many of Carr's strengths and many of Carr's polemical strengths as well, but also I think Carr's weaknesses as well. So I mean, these are all things I think we can talk about. What I wanted to concentrate here particularly is one sort of engagement with this, and it doesn't really come into mostly and very much into Phil's introduction, I think, because in some respects what I'm criticizing here is not necessarily something that's central to what Phil's talking about. What you're talking about, Phil, is that you are very much rooted in the 21st century, and it's the 21st century and the future that you're hoping to be able to influence, and again, in some respects, very much like Carr as well in the 20 Years Crisis. But I think for me, there are, even though I see Carr's book in your book, I don't necessarily see the interwar period in your book, and so these are a number of things I wanted to sort of bring out. I mean, Carr's 20 Years Crisis is not a rigorous analysis of the interwar period. And, if you use 20 Years Crisis as a way to understand the interwar period, you're not understanding the interwar period. It's like using St. Augustine's Confessions to understand late Roman Empire. It's more reading between the lines. And, of course, one of the things Carr does, and Phil kind of takes this as as well when talking about 21st century IR. What Carr really does with his concept of utopianism, of course, is invent his own enemy. It's all the people he disagreed with on the major issues of the day, particularly on appeasement. Carr's an appeaser. The people he criticizes are mostly not appeasers. So there's a kind of what archaeologists call a text-hindered aspect, I think, to using Carr, that you know, particularly when we're trying to unpick the interwar period, and particularly we're looking at what people were saying in the interwar period, you have to kind of let the text speak for themselves. And the problem with using Carr is Carr speaks for other people, and he often gets them wrong. And people at the time, you read the responses to this 20 Years Crisis, people, and I'm sure, Phil, you're going to get this reaction from many of the people that you were talking about as well, is that you know, they were going, "This isn't me. You know, Carr's got me wrong. He's got us all wrong. You know, Carr's misunderstanding what we're saying." And you know, with due reason. I think one of the key issues here, and again, it doesn't necessarily affect the core of what you're saying there, Phil, is that the interwar period really wasn't a period of liberal order. It isn't a liberal period. It's actually a low point for liberalism. And it's not really an order. I mean, I think you're hard-pressed to see it. In the 20s, it's an attempt to create order, and in the 30s, it's a complete unraveling. So it's not really a liberal order in the sense. So there's, in that sense, the comparison with our day and unipolarity don't really hold. You know, you describe in the book, Phil, kind of, you know, 1919 as a victory for liberalism. But actually, you know, reading the texts at the time, and you think of people like Keynes and Angel, they talk in 1919, 1920, 1921 about the eclipse of the laissez-faire liberal order, the end of the Victorian order. And you get this as well in people like Stretchy's books, you know, the eminent Victorians. They're basically burying Victorian classical liberalism, particularly in the form of Bernard Bosanquet, who of course is savaged by many of his contemporaries at the time. And also, you know, this is not a Wilsonian order too. Wilson comes onto the stage in 1919 as the conquering hero. He leaves it as basically someone who's been circumvented and defeated. This is not a Wilsonian order. If you're going to talk about, you know, who's forming this order, and you want to pick some sort of politicians to nail it to, I'd say Poincaré and Baldwin are better people to nail it on. But even that, you know, is I think is oversimplification. It's an eclipsing of classical liberalism. There is liberalism here, but it's a new liberalism. It's a hybrid liberalism. It's taken the lessons of the war, which is that laissez-faire is dead, that we need more we need more government. There's experimentations with different forms of government and governments in the 1920s, and of course neoliberalism, the big bugbear. And we know this from, and I know you read and admired this, Phil, Quinn Slobodian's book on globalists, is of course when he's talking about them in the 20s and 30s, particularly in the 30s, the decade that gave us the phrase neoliberalism, they're writing as people from the outside. They've been circumvented, and you know, they remain marginal really until well after the Second World War, and really until the 1970s and 1980s. So this is not a neoliberal order. It's the neoliberals do not recognize themselves in the interwar order. And finally, I just want to sort of look at Carr's analysis. Of course, I mean, this is not something you stress. Now, you know, it's, you don't say that he isn't, but also it's something you don't stress. But I think it's very important in terms of looking at the 20 Years Crisis. And of course, you know, I'm not talking about other works by Carr here, but particularly about the 20 Years Crisis, is that, of course, he's an appeaser. He's supporting appeasement, but a particular kind of appeasement. He's in favor of peaceful change. He wants states to be able to, and I say, going back to power, this concept of power, which he is trying to stress here, is that states should be negotiating rather than fighting shifts in power. And so for him, of course, Munich 1938 is a brilliant example of what peaceful change should be in the future. And so, you know, that's the background of Carr. And of course, yes, he is obsessed with the concept of the have and have not countries. But have and have not means something different. And this is where there's a kind of a difference with the 21st century. Have and have not wasn't about status quo and revisionist powers per se. The have and have not thesis was about who had access to raw materials and who didn't, who had access to territories for surplus population and who didn't. So the have powers were US, UK, France, and the Soviet Union. The have not powers were Japan, Germany, Italy. And of course, it isn't about who won in 1919 in the First World War, because of course the victors and the vanquished are equally split on that. And it's a deeply, actually, imperialist way of looking at the world. The people arguing for the have-not powers were saying that Italy and Germany and Japan needed overseas territories to conquer in order to be able to extract raw materials and to settle populations. This is a deeply imperialist way of thinking, and it comes back, I think, and you do mention this as well in your criticisms of Carr, actually, in the book, that there is this element of Carr which is deeply undemocratic, deeply imperialist, actually. So there's that. Also, Carr didn't invent realism. This kind of realist idealist or realist utopian split is something that's kind of in the air. And usually it's a way of dividing left and right. I think where Carr is different is that he tries to remove it from that left-right split. But quite often the self-identified realists, and this links back to this imperialism issue, were of course imperialists. I mean, F.E. Smith talks in favor in the 20s of realism, and by realism he means imperialism. So that's an underlying aspect in Carr which is problematic. There's also, I think, another issue is that I really like Carr. My copy of the 20 Years Crisis is falling apart. It's lost its cover. And, he's a fascinating character. Frustrating, but fascinating. And I think, he's, as you've pulled out, Phil, he's actually very useful in much of his sort of theoretical and philosophical ways that he looks at the world. And, of course, What is History, I still use for teaching. But the problem for Carr, I think, is that and this is the kind of the division. He's a great theorist, absolutely awful foreign policy analyst. He pretty much gets, and I know myself, and I think Sean's here as well. Sean Malloy is one of the audience members here. And Sean doesn't totally agree with me on this, to be fair, but I would argue that he pretty much gets every foreign policy issue wrong in the 20th century. And one of the biggest ones he gets wrong, actually, is appeasement. Not because necessarily appeasement was right or wrong, but that E.H. Carr's view of what appeasement was deeply wrong. And there's very interesting, I think a wonderful thing to read on Carr is his 1936 inaugural lecture, which then gets published in International Affairs. And in that, one of the things he says in that is one of the things that the pacifists get wrong is they read politicians at their face value and not look behind what the politicians are arguing. And of course, Carr is right. But the irony is, in his foreign policy, is that Carr commits the very mistake he criticizes his opponents for making. And he interprets Chamberlain in the 20 Years Crisis. You have to look at the 1939 edition with the bits that Carr later cut out. He says that Chamberlain is introducing it's peaceful change. He's creating a new order in Europe. It's leading to peace. And this, of course, is what Chamberlain said publicly. But in private, of course, Chamberlain's appeasement had a goal, and that goal was to prepare Britain for war. Chamberlain in 1938 knew war was coming. Carr didn't. So Carr misread the signs. Chamberlain wanted to prevent Germany having a free hand in Europe. Carr wanted him to, in Eastern Europe. Carr wanted Germany to have a free hand in Europe and thought Chamberlain had given him that. So there's a kind of, there's a mismatch there. The other issue as well, and I don't know, we can probably talk about this, about things that have changed since you've published as well, Phil, on yours, is that, of course, one of the great tragedies for Carr at the 20 Years Crisis was, it comes out at the beginning of 1939, yet two major events in 1939 actually pretty much invalidate Carr's major argument about appeasement. One of them, of course, is the invasion of rump Czechoslovakia by the Nazis, basically making Munich a dead letter. And the other one is Britain's open-ended guarantee to Poland. Both of these basically mean that the appeasement argument and, the kind of the main raison d'etre in terms of the foreign policy aspect of 20 Years Crisis disappears the minute it's published. And I suppose the question to ask you, Phil, on this one is, and this is a problem us academics, whenever we make predictions, run into, and we're all guilty of this, is, have events since the book was written, Phil, how have they challenged, your thesis? I'm thinking particularly the pandemic, the possible defeat of Trump. I don't know what's going to happen in the US, but various things that have happened since, the heavy shift in the world towards dealing with climate change. How have these kind of impacted your own kind of conclusions, in the same way that the events of 1939 impacted on Carr's argument? But anyway, really enjoyed the book, Phil, and anyway, I really enjoy kind of getting into the long grass and the arguments with you here.
Thanks so much, Luke. Phil, you have the opportunity to come in.
Yeah, thank you very much, Luke. Particularly for, I always enjoy and learn and benefit from your the level of detail and insight into the interwar period that you have, and indeed I draw on it heavily for the book as well. I suppose I would say I would say a few things in response to some of the points you make. So Carr's model of the kind of interwar period across the 20s and the 30s. I mean, this is why he calls it 20 Years Crisis, and connecting the kind of the disintegration and the challenges of the late 30s to problems that were sown, or the seeds were sown in the post-war settlement, in the Paris peace treaties, in the aftermath of the First World War. So he's making the claim that the failures of the 30s are rooted in the failed policies and ideals and hopes of the 1920s. And I think, the frustration or the attempt to perpetuate the naive liberal hopes of the 1920s and 1930s, even if foreign policies and politics had already shifted by the 30s to some degree. I don't think there's any doubt that there was still tremendous kind of liberal hopes that were still kind of in the air. If we think about the World Disarmament Conference in 1932, the Kellogg-Briand Pact was in 1928. The astonishing kind of depth of attachment that British public opinion demonstrated with its commitment to the League of Nations in response to Italy's invasion of Abyssinia, the desperate attempt and hope that the League of Nations would be effective in its response to the Manchurian crisis and to the Abyssinian crisis. And so, I don't think Carr was wrong to still be frustrated in the 1930s by the continuing prevalence of what he took to be kind of liberal politics and liberal naivety. Now, that said, I would say, was it a liberal order? Was it liberal, and was it an order? I suppose, this depends on how we understand things. And I think one thing that Carr does get right is that he makes clear that liberalism was senescent by the interwar period. And the reason that it exists, the reason that there's an attempt to recreate it in the interwar period, is because it's been extruded back into Europe by Wilsonianism, by the remarkable strength of American power and influence, and that this reflects the benefit that the US enjoyed in its unprecedented geopolitical and economic expansion in the 19th century, and the fact that it had been saved from balance of power politics because it had no competitors on the North American continent and was protected by the oceans, and was therefore able, in Carr's view, to retain all the kind of naivety of high Victorian kind of 19th century liberalism, and then in the flush of victory in the aftermath of the First World War to bring it back to kind of try and impose it on Europe, a model that simply didn't fit the reality of the politics and economics of the time. And the senescence of liberalism is, I think, something that we forget, and that we, in the discipline of IR, and particularly because there is the kind of the way in which, to some degree, it's still taught, is this kind of this first kind of joust between liberalism and challenges to liberalism in the interwar period makes it seem as if liberalism just emerged in 1919 with the foundation of the discipline itself, in the aftermath of the First World War, when the whole point of Carr's critique is that liberalism was old. And if liberalism was old and senescent, if Carr was right that liberalism was old and senescent by the interwar period, then obviously it begs the question for us of what is the status of liberalism now, given that we, as I say, that we keep on seeking to recreate it. So I think that the kind of the pervasive attachment to liberalism and to Wilsonianism broadly understood is not something that should be underestimated, and not least in our own period as well. I mean, we have the so-called Wilsonianism on steroids. That was the war on terror, the attempt to democratize Iraq and Afghanistan, the astonishingly naive expectations that went with that, the neo-Wilsonian politics that has dominated liberal kind of aspirations for change since the end of the Cold War. So I don't think the liberal politics, I don't think, can be so easily buried and dismissed. However much the detail of the picture might look, it still seems to me that it's proven remarkably resilient and powerful in some ways, and also tremendously destructive, as we can see in the wreckage of states that these neo-Wilsonian policies have left behind in places like Libya and Iraq and Afghanistan, and Syria too, I suppose, to a lesser extent as well. So on this question of Carr's Carr's status as an appeaser, I don't think, I mean, beyond the points I make, perhaps learning from Carr's mistakes, hopefully, I've avoided trying to make any foreign policy suggestions in the book, at least, beyond the broad implication that the forever wars should be brought to a swift end as soon as possible. I don't think I'm convinced. I mean, I'm confident that that's one point which I won't regret having put my neck on the line for, as it were, and that I won't be, that criticism of the forever wars and the neo-Wilsonianism of liberal foreign policy, that I won't be caught out by future developments on that. And also it's a point, it's an argument I've been making for a long time. So it's something that I would, stick to. How far, I mean, the other element of it, I suppose, is Carr's criticisms are, or Carr's overestimation of totalitarianism, not only of Nazi Germany, but principally the Soviet Union, is something which I think is, it's obviously a blind spot of Carr, but an interesting blind spot, in that his overestimation of totalitarianism, his underestimation of liberalism, of international liberalism and politics, it seems to me, somewhat contrary to what you said, Luke, I think, is one of the things that makes him so useful and interesting to think with. And his overestimation of totalitarianism, it seems to me that is one of the most important lessons for our 20 years crisis, is not to overestimate the solidity of power. So, and Carr very much took the conclusion, the Hegelian, where it's associated with Hegel, the Hegelian notion that world history is the world court. And that seems to me that if we take that, and I'm happy to take that, the verdicts of world history, and to take the verdict of world history as a more important world court, then that seems to me that it's resoundingly condemned the totalitarianism of the 20th century, but also even autocracy and dictatorship, right down into our contemporary era. I mean, if we think of the the remarkable kind of and moving kind of heroism, say, of protesters in Sudan or Algeria, and their attempts to overthrow the military rule and autocracy there. It seems to me that we are compelled to accept the Hegelian conclusion with Carr, even if it takes us against some of what Carr thought to be true, which was the durability of the authoritarian superpowers such as the Soviet Union. So I suppose that's how I would try to fend off some of the criticisms with respect to the interwar period and with respect to the character of liberalism both then and now, and its continuing significance. And with respect to whether or not events having challenged my thesis, I don't think Trump's ejection from the White House and his loss to Joe Biden presages what will be. There is clearly an attempt to recreate the heyday of post-Cold War international liberalism, but it seems to me that's quickly going to, that's a lot of that is, in essence, it's an attempt to kind of put up a front, but a lot of the basic orientation of the Trump administration, it seems, will continue, including reinvigorated geopolitical challenge or confrontation with China. So to that degree, it seems to me that my 20 years crisis is vindicated because it's over. I suppose I should say that my choice of the date of 1999 for our 20 years crisis was two events. The first was the Kosovo War, where you had the kind of supremacy of humanitarian intervention, the high point of post-Cold War liberal idealism. And that set the scene for the neo-Wilsonianism that came subsequently with the invasions of Iraq, Afghanistan, the bombing of Libya, and the erection of the responsibility to protect. And the other important event in 1999 is the foundation of the euro. So the introduction of the Eurozone onto currency markets. And the Eurozone is still very much with us and still very much punishing its at least the southern tier of the Eurozone is still suffering within the constraints imposed upon it. And it seems to me that the Eurozone is very much, very easily is subject to the kinds of criticisms that Carr develops, not only in the 20 years crisis, but also in his other writings on the interwar period and the failed attempts to economically revive the gold standard and everything that followed with that in the interwar period. Because the Eurozone is in many ways a recreation of the gold standard. You might even call it a gold standard on steroids. In some ways, it's more rigid, less flexible than the gold standard of the interwar period is, but it's just as it has proved to be just as economically destructive. So the problems of the Eurozone aren't going away. The problems of the European Union aren't going away either. And this has, very much been vindicated with the fiasco over vaccines in the European Union, it seems to me. With the pandemic and climate change, I suppose in terms of the way in which the politics of climate change will play out, it seems to me like there will be increasing, one aspect of that will be greater geopolitical conflict of various kinds, greater interest, say, in competition in the Arctic Circle, greater competition over resources, say lithium, that goes into all the new kind of power sources, electric batteries and what have you, to replace fossil fuels. So it seems to me that the naive kind of ideas of climate change politics of our 20 years crisis are going to fall by the wayside. And as for the pandemic, I think I suppose it could be seen as the cataclysm that kind of punctuates our own 20-year crisis. It's been the response in itself and the terrible mismanagement of it in many countries seems to me to indicate just how difficult our political situation is. So I don't think to that extent any of those events would invalidate the broad arguments made in the book.
Thanks, Phil. And since we are already receiving questions from the audience, to which I would like to turn in a moment, but before we do, I would of course also like to jump at the opportunity and use the prerogative of the chair to also squeeze in some of the points that I'd like to push you on. I very much like how you, and also cleverly in the book, go about us having to learn not just from the things that Carr got right and could be instructive about in our current predicament, but also from his mistakes and diagnostic mistakes. At one point, I think already follows from what Luke suggested. I mean, how do you personally reconcile in your approach this underpinning undemocratic zest of much of Carr's writing and reading of his politics of his time, with your own, I think, intuitive sympathies towards what you call mass democracy and mass politics, which you also have boldly shown in the context of the Brexit. And what I want to sort of push you more on is precisely this core notion that I think both you and Carr share. And this is the concept of power, because just like in Carr's classic, power is very much the central concept. And so it is, in your argument, but I think neither of you really provide a very straightforward, clear definition or unpacking of what is actually your take on power. And of course, relatedly, since, I'm not necessarily there to defend the turf where I should, feel as touched, what you broadly frame as constructivist critical IR. But I think, could it be that it's not about the disregard of power when it comes to, for instance, post-structuralists, or critical constructivists in the US language of the term, such as Jutta Welles, that they are not disregarding power as much as they are talking and understanding power, the different dimensions of it, emphasizing the different dimensions than you perhaps have in mind. So maybe, you could say something in response to that.
Sure, and thank you, Maria. So with the, as I say, I mean, I think for the Carr's kind of his blasé contempt for certain kinds of politics. So I think he saw, as far as I take him to, or as far as I follow or understand his claim, he understood kind of mass politics breaking through liberal democracy, and that there would be some kind of new form of mass politics that would be kind of more centralized and efficient, and that would not that would be popular, and that would express popular will in a way that kind of pushed past the inefficiencies of liberal democracy. And some of this comes across in his post-war writings and in his other work, The Soviet Impact on the Western World. So I think he was, but he was never particularly concerned with articulating the details of how this the kind of the popular aspirations and the authentic, the kind of maintaining the authentic interests of mass politics would be maintained in post-liberal democracy. He took it as a given that it was developing in that direction, and that it didn't need him to kind of provide detailed schemas of how it might work. And to that extent, he was, he was, to say he was blasé would be putting it kindly, about the ease with which he was willing to accept authoritarian mass politics as a model of what future politics should hold. And obviously, I don't share any of that. And the model, though, I mean, but his rootedness in mass politics, his claim that mass politics, incursions of mass politics, are partly what helped to disintegrate liberal kind of naivety and the liberal institutions and ideals of the interwar period, that seems to me to still hold. And it's the incompatibility of liberal order with mass politics, I think, is visible in partly, I mean, most dramatically and obviously with Brexit, but also with the structures of the European Union, which seem to me that they're, insofar as they function effectively, they function effectively by being insulated from mass politics. They function by being raised at a level above the nation state. They function by being dependent on so many institutions that are insulated from popular pressure and from democratic accountability. And so, in a sense, I think, as I make the case in the book, the institutions of the European Union prove Carr's point in reverse. So he thought the liberalism was disintegrating under the pressure of nationalism and the mass politics that came with it. And it seems to me it proves it in reverse, because the only way in which there's been the capacity to maintain a harmony of interests in Europe has been at the elite level, when elites have been able to insulate their decision-making from the public pressure that comes in domestic arenas of mass politics. So with that, I mean, I have, Carr, I think, provides some insight, but I have no truck or sympathy with the direction in which he takes them. And as I said in response to Luke, I would stay with Carr's point about world history being the world court on that matter. So use his own kind of analytic claim against the conclusions that he draws and the verdicts on and to draw a different verdict on the 20th century. On the question of power and this central concept, and that critical constructivists draw our attention to different dimensions of power, I think that the question of state power and competition for power has dropped out of those analyses. So it seems to me that that there is simply no ability to accommodate very basic questions of geopolitical contestation as a model of power within those analyses. So all the different dimensions, the kind of these refinements of the understanding of power that many international relations scholars have sought to develop in the post-Cold War era, they still seem to me to share the same kind of basic, to be rooted in an underlying, to take for granted the underlying distribution of power in the international order of the time, and the fact that they are insensitive to international politics being ultimately about hard questions of power political contestation between states, rather than the more kind of refined and delicate operations of power, say in shaping identities through discourse and through forms of power that aren't rooted in state competition. So that would be my response, I suppose. It's a plea to the discipline to be willing to very decisively return to questions of power that are rooted in the competition for power between states, and to understand international order as a vociferous and contested form, but not contested between, say, different actors and with different ontologies of international politics, but international politics is based around competition between states. And that central dynamic, I think we have to keep that uppermost in our understanding of international politics, and it's something which I think has fallen by the wayside, and I hope that Carr helps to bring that point back to us.
Thanks so much. And we have now the question, even though I think somewhat mistakenly we already have the note next to it that it has been answered live. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. I guess it's up to you to decide, but I will read it out nonetheless. It's from our PhD student at BSIS, whom I have also the pleasure to supervise, Thomas Chevalier, and he finds the debate fascinating. Thank you, Thomas. And he asks about the role of new IR theories in framing the illusion the world can be remodeled through agency, according to your critique, Phil. How do you engage with the emphasis put on structure by some of these theoretical frameworks? More precisely, I guess, here we would benefit from the specification, of course, which ones. Don't they serve to some extent your arguments by identifying some of the rigidities and continuities of the international power struggle you engage with? And I guess here we also reach the technical limit of the webinar, that the one who asked the question can't actually, expand. But maybe you got the essence.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's, I take aim at a kind of a certain types of international relations theories whose influence seems to me to be extensive, particularly in Europe and in Anglo-American, particularly British international relations. It's not to say it's the entirety of the discipline, but I'm also kind of unconvinced by the claims that are often made for the kind of the structuralist accounts as well. So for instance, international political economy, particularly of the critical variant, it still seems to me to fall prey to many of the same problems that critical constructivist theories have. So whereas I've said critical constructivist theories tend to be that in their emphasis on agency and change and contingency, they've expressed the conceit of US power in the unipolar world. It seems to me that the problem with the kind of the Coxian inspired international political economy, which is sought to look at structures more, it doesn't seem to me to get around some of those basic problems. And that it still seems to me to be essentially insensitive to power as something which is associated with contestation and with state, with the competition between states over political power. So with their, the whole kind of the shift, say, or the basis of kind of Gramscian-inspired critical IR is to bracket questions of state power and to focus on non-state forms of power, essentially, and to understand power in terms of hegemony and in terms of how it operates in global civil society, how it operates in international institutions, how it operates in international organizations. And in that move, which is inspired by Gramsci, and filtered through Robert Cox's own work, they still seem to effectively reproduce the same basic problem, that they seek to understand power in the form of consent rather than in forms of the overt domination of the state. And in putting the state to one side, and they focus on all the kind of the subtle machinations through which power reproduces itself through consensual forms, the state has fallen out of the picture. And so we end up with these supposedly structuralist accounts, it seems to me, reproducing deeply naive views of international politics, which are unable to, they'll kind of give us these very compelling pictures of, say, the role of international organizations in peace building, in, the exploitation of indigenous and marginal peoples, with corporations seeking to plunder natural resources in various parts of the world, whether in Amazon or Indonesia, or whatever it might be. But these models are still predicated on making competition for power between states invisible. And that kind of basic pivot is built into the structure of Gramscian-inspired IR and of IPE. And so it seems to me it falls to the same charge. So I'm not sure which particular structuralist models the questioner had in mind, but at least for those kind of structuralist models, they still seem to me, as I say, to still share the same problem, even though they think that they don't.
Thanks much, Phil. I recommend everyone who would like to ask their question and has hesitated and prevaricated until now is the time to type them into the Q&A box, and we'll pick them up. Luke, would you like to come in, perhaps?
Sorry, just remembering to unmute myself, which is kind of the new pandemic common mistake we all make, isn't it? Yeah, I maybe just flowing off from what I'd said earlier, but also sort of linking into Maria's comment. I mean, and this is something I think in some respects you do share with Carr on this one, is that Carr kind of puts everyone he doesn't agree with in a box, and then attacks them with the same tools. It's not very subtle, and I suppose one accusation that might come at you, Phil, is that you do the same thing. I mean, when you actually talk about and you talk about a wide variety. You're not you're not unaware of the major differences. I mean, you've been in the IR game long enough, you know all of these approaches. But actually, it does seem to be a very wide group of approaches with very, very different views. And again, with very different views of how to interpret reality, the real, and how we can understand the world. One particular, I think, is very early on, and I think you could take out that whole small section of the introduction. It would make no difference in terms of your book. Was the kind of the criticism of the planet politics people, who of course have a very different approach, and also actually very critical of the structures of IR. And many of their criticisms of IR are not dissimilar from your own criticisms, but you kind of accuse them of being, a sort of part of the unipolar moment, which struck them as strange, because when you read the Planet Politics Manifesto, it's right from the beginning. It's talking about its concerns and talking about Bangladesh, talking about the Niger Delta, that much of what they're talking about in terms of also a return of a real and a return of power, which is that human societies often forget something very real, which is that we exist within ecologies, and also and something that Carr knew as well, because Carr's interest is very much focused on the effects of industrialization. Unlike many other classical realists, in fact, he is actually rooted in political economy in that sense. And of course, Randall Germain has mentioned this, and you mentioned this very well, and I think that's very well done when you discuss that, Phil. But there's another real here, which is kind of the real that societies are set in ecologies, that they're defined. They are what they eat. They're defined by the power sources they use and the limits of the power sources they use. And of course, one of the things that the Planet Politics people bring out in quite some detail is, in fact, again, a point similar to your own, which is the inequalities of society. Those who benefited from the emissions of greenhouse gases, the global north, and particularly the United States, are different from the people who seriously suffer from climate change, which is the global south, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, the Niger Delta, Bangladesh, South Asia in general. So, I'm just wondering there that on that sort of issue, that perhaps, you're doing IR a service in all that you do, but perhaps like Carr, do you cast your net too wide? And that in fact, when you actually look at IR, around IR, there are groups that you may not 100% agree with all the time, that actually have a common, similar, or at least family resemblance goals to you. And in some respects, is there a danger that you've probably put everyone into the same box, like Carr did, and that this is actually counterproductive for what you're trying to do, which is to, which is to kind of sort of change IR, to get IR to broaden its horizons. So anyway, yeah, just just a small question.
No, not at all. It's a very good one. Would you like me to answer it, Maria, now? Yeah. And in fact, it brings me back to an earlier question, which I didn't fully address, which is when you raised the criticism that, as with Carr, as Carr invented enemies, so have I. I suppose my response to that would be, that was certainly my understanding of Carr when I first read him. As an undergraduate and then subsequently as a postgraduate in Carr's alma mater in Aberystwyth in Wales, when I did my masters, and obviously there was obviously a significant emphasis on Carr there, as rightly so there should be, and at the time, so this was, when was this? This was 2003, 2004. It did seem to me like very much that was the way it seemed to me, that it was kind of he was inventing these kinds of cardboard cutout accounts, and that it wasn't convincing, at the remove of so many years from the interwar period. And then I realized I was more persuaded when all of these resemblances began to strike me across this wide variety of different theoretical approaches. As I say, they all seem to me, for all of the kind of the wondrous and the lush profusion of international relations that we have today, international relations theory in particular, they seem to me to share certain kinds of basic naivety. And those seem to me to reflect their common taproot in a particular political soil. And that political soil was the era in which the era of unipolar globalization, the post-Cold War era broadly conceived, that was falling apart, kind of disintegrating over the period of our 20 years crisis, as I've sought to put forward here. And so this process of identification and rooting kind of a whole set of theories in a common kind of substructure of the international order, in a common dispensation of power. It seems to me productive, intellectually productive, to identify affinities and to try to think about those connections. Obviously, it's up to the reader to judge whether or not how effectively I do that. But I would say this: I think what we haven't done in IR as a discipline, as scholars and as social scientists for a very long time, is to try to connect theories to underlying structures of international power. And I try and think about how our debates are locked into underlying dispensations of power in a way, and particularly contestation of power between states. And it seems to me that the so-called First Great Debate, in which Carr was a participant in the interwar period, and as much as there was a great debate, it seems to me that it did try to do that. It did try to connect claims about the nature of the ideas that were being discussed to how they were locked into the underlying political order. And that seems to me something which critical constructivists absolutely do not do. They refuse to consider, on the whole, they refuse to consider how they are themselves implicated and bound up with a particular kind of international order. So I will stick to my guns on invention of enemies. I don't think I do. And I think if at the very least, I would stick to the claim about the need for this theoretical reflexivity that we've lost. That it's incumbent on us to think about not how other people's ideas are related to underlying structures of power, but how our own ideas express underlying structures of power. It's not sufficient to say, they're doing pragmatic problem-solving theory, I'm doing critical theory, I'm a good person because I'm doing critical theory, my normative aspirations are not those of, the hegemonic Western states, or whatever you want to say, and that being satisfied with that simplistic bifurcation and statement of normative intent, that's sufficient to exonerate you from being bound up with an existing political order. On the question of planet politics and the return of a real, here too, I mean, I'll stick to my guns on the point that it seems to me that the claims about the Anthropocene in particular, that does seem to me to share in the naivety of a Euro-Atlantic conceited outlook. So even though it kind of talks about, as you say, the kind of these regions of the world which are bearing the brunt of changes in climate, that nonetheless they're understood as regions. They're understood as kind of geographic areas. They're understood as the Amazon or the Niger Delta. They're not understood as nations with their own kind of independent political aspirations as nations, as Bangladesh or as Nigeria or as Brazil, with its tremendously kind of complex politics given the current government in Brazil and what it's doing. So it's not, I think, the very kind of attempt to disaggregate and disintegrate the geopolitical framework of nation states into a different picture, that seems to me to speak to, like I say, a kind of a Euro-Atlantic conceit that could only be possible in the era of US unipolarity. And I think it's unavoidable, and this is the hard, I mean, here I'll kind of go with the kind of a hard political realism, that all of our claims, all of the and all the challenges that we confront in addressing those very, as you say, real things, Luke, about how we consume, about how we produce, and how we secure our power sources in industrial civilization of the day, that all of those are going to be refracted through power political competition. It will be a matter of how far, say, going through the melted ice of the Arctic trade route, how far that cuts down times for delivery, and how far states contest access to those newly open trade routes and control over them, how far there's contestation over the seabed, mining the seabed, how far there's contestation over access to new power sources. So whatever the challenge looks like, there is no avoiding the fact that we're going to have to thread all of those. We're going to have to thread those challenges through the viewpoint of states competing with each other. And it will have to be managed in that way. And so I think kind of elevating this kind of mesmerizing sublime of a biosphere or an Anthropocene that kind of hovers above the merely paltry concerns of human beings and their politics, that seems to me, again, to kind of share in the naivety of the unipolar moment. And so that would be my response. I'd say that notwithstanding the I can appreciate the elegance and the insight of some of the claims about planet politics, but it still seems to me to share in the naivety, which is a conceit of a particular place in a particular time, and also a liberal idealist one, it seems to me, even a liberal utopian one, that is going to find itself subject to a remorseless critique, not my critique, but the critique of power politics in the new century itself.
Well, I guess, the planet politics people, as interpretivists generally, would probably disagree on some of the, core epistemological premises when it comes to how the facts that both you and Carr very greatly valorize actually emerge. Because, obviously, when we think of, yes, facts should be central to our analysis and we should proceed from facts, we still have to, make decisions about how they come about. Remember Hayden White, events happen, facts are established. And I guess the planet politics people would just also suggest that there are many other forces besides the nation states that are now, in charge of also making certain facts to happen and emerge in that sense. We have a hugely engaging contribution from our colleague at Canterbury, Sean Molloy, who of course should be, part and parcel of this debate here. But since we didn't want to overcrowd the Kent presence in the panel, now all the kernels of wisdom are in the Q&A box. I'll try to read some of them out so that Phil could get back to them. So, as usual, Sean says, I find myself in disagreement with both parties, so that's the best start for any debate, right? To Phil, Carr was a critical theorist. He's fascinated by Bergson. Lukács' literary theory has many parallels with Horkheimer. Full disclosure, there will be an article coming out in ISQ by Sean soon on the very topic. Carr is opposed to positivism. Importantly, he also was not opposed to utopianism. He's an advocate of utopianism in the right sense, which I think in a way you actually allude you yourself are as well, because you say that, well, the utopianism of the critical / constructivists, critical theorists, constructivists is of the sort of too lukewarm kind, whereas a more radical utopianism could be found in the kind of mass democratic politics that you advocate for, right? And I quickly read out the rest so that, you both could come back in. And then to Luke, Carr's critics say that he didn't get them right. To paraphrase Andy Rice Davies, they would say that, wouldn't they? And liberalism in interwar periods, we need to differentiate between UK and France. You know, you can see, so the UK was obsessed with the restoration of the pre-war system, domestically, internationally. The gold standard was an operation in willful 19th century nostalgia, pursues laissez-faire until the 1930s. And then a few words on appeasement. Carr's interwar work is a study of the ethical failure of the warring parties to reconcile after the First World War. Munich was the last chance for reconciliation, the fruit of the failures of Versailles. He expands elsewhere that appeasement of someone was necessary in 1938, either Germany or the USSR. And the UK bundled the policy by ultimately alienating both of these states. So whoever wants to come in first in response, please. Thank you, Sean.
I can jump in quickly. Yeah, it's great, and it's great to have Sean here. And this just continues arguments that Sean and I, arguments over in ISA, well, friendly ones that we have. But on the issue of Carr and the critical theorist, I know Sean's done a lot of work on this, and I think it's a really good fleshing out of Carr, and it fits very neatly, I think, also with Randall Germain's discussion of Carr as a political economist as well. So I think on that point, but Phil may want to work out a bit more on that one. On the other issues, I think, love the Mandy Rhys Davis quote, but I think the crucial thing here is not only were the people Carr criticised didn't feel that they'd actually been undermined, but many people who were outside looking in also felt that that Carr had got things wrong. I mean, this is one of the, whether they were justified in that or not is another question, but the reason why Carr was kind of marginalized within British war preparations is a good example of that. I would agree with Sean that yes, there is a strong element in British policy at the time. It's very different from the French. In kind of trying to return to the status quo ante the pre-war, and that this was disastrous. I mean, and in fact, there's a really good chapter in the Polanyi's Great Transformation on the cutting of the golden thread, the issue around the gold standard, which is another example actually of how little 19th century liberalism there was in the interwar period. And on the appeasement questions, I mean, this is again a debate that Sean and I have sort of had. How good was Carr's sort of grasp of what was going on, and in terms of the roles with appeasement, and and again taking Sean's point that there's a very three-dimensional discussion that historians have about appeasement. And appeasement's a lot more complicated than we think. But I still would stand by that issue that really Carr misunderstood what the Chamberlain government was doing, and that actually, in some respects, there's a two cheers here for British policy, is that Britain did get the war when it wanted in 1939, when it was ready, and when the Germans weren't ready. And in some respects, the real turning point here is not 1938 or 1939, but 1940. France should never have fallen in 1940. That kind of completely changed the Allies' plans. It completely changed the trajectory of the world. In many respects, there's a lot to be said for the way that Britain and France kind of planned their confrontation with Germany. And it was all really thrown into the into the garbage by the failure of the Allied generals to win the war in France, which should have been an Allied victory. They outnumbered the Germans in so many things, including in armor. So in some respects, that's a showing how important luck is. It isn't all about structures in international relations. Sometimes it's just sheer dumb luck, and that kind of May 1940 is a major turning point. Anyway, there's a lot for you to answer there, Phil.
Yeah, and I certainly agree with what Luke said about the kind of the dynamics of the Second World War, particularly and how clear and visible I think that is in retrospect. And it's I suppose it's important. It's still important for us, I think, in how much we still kind of retrospectively elevate Nazi Germany, when in fact it's kind of the extent of its power in the war, as Luke suggests, a lot of it came through kind of accidents of luck, and though its defeat, I think, was never in doubt, essentially, once the war was going. The real issue was how long the war took for Germany to be defeated, and particularly the terrible kind of human cost that came with that length of time. So I suppose beyond the kind of the detail of the historical moment, I'd say that is one of the important points that I would echo from what Luke just said about still our tendency to overestimate the power of Nazi Germany, and how that continues, I think, in some ways that continues to kind of haunt our contemporary politics right through to the present. But that aside, with respect to Sean's points, and I would echo what Luke said. I mean, thanks for such wonderful and incisive points, Sean, and I'm delighted you could make it. So the first thing I suppose I'd say is with respect to liberalism in the UK versus France. I wouldn't disagree, but at the same time, I think there is always the risk of disintegrating the analysis, or kind of letting the jigsaw fall into all of its constituent parts, and it depends very much on what you're trying to say and how you're trying to say it, I suppose. I wouldn't disagree with the point about the kind of the contestation or the different views of Britain and France, but I don't think it undermines the point about or the claims that I tried to make about liberal order. Just as much as, I mean, as you could say today, there are disagreements today, say, I mean, very evidently, say, between France and the UK and the US in 2003 over the invasion of Iraq. Politically important and significant, but I don't think it wouldn't lead me to think that there wasn't, that we can't talk about all three of them belonging to the permanent three on the UN Security Council, constituting an axis on the UN Security Council, or being able to talk in the broad terms of a political West, which incorporates all three of them. So, these kind of questions, while I take the point, I think they're a matter of judgment as to what level of analysis we're looking at and what kind of questions we're trying to answer. So I would stick to, I'd stick to the claim that it's still possible to talk in terms of international liberalism, notwithstanding the fact that there are obviously divergences among the various states that constitute that order. On the point about the kind of the more substantive and lengthier question about Carr as a critical theorist, here, I mean, I look forward to reading, obviously, the article in ISQ. I'm not convinced that he's a critical theorist in the way that the early critical theorists understood themselves. He's not a positivist, certainly, and it would be anachronistic to impose the terms of post-war international relations debates onto him. But I don't think that would count him as a critical theorist, capital C, capital T. Particularly, I mean, the way in which the critical theorists were so horrified by Stalinism and by fascism, and particularly by the way in which the threat that those two types of politics posed to what they took to be the achievements of bourgeois modernity. Or what we would call liberal, they would call bourgeois. And Carr didn't share that horror. Far from it, as we've discussed about already. So I think that puts him in a different camp from people like Adorno and Horkheimer. So I don't, notwithstanding his fascination with people like Lukács, I don't think I'm unconvinced by the attempt to make him a Frankfurter after the fact. And I also think that the kind of later attempts to make him into an early critical theorist, which were undertaken by people like Andrew Linklater, again, that he's kind of a cosmopolitan, a visionary who foresaw the need to supersede the nation state. I'm unconvinced by those arguments too, for reasons that I go into detail in the book about. That I think it's a misreading of his account of the failure of the nation state. And it draws the wrong lessons from his analysis about the nation state, with significantly negative implications for how we understand politics in Europe today. So, I mean, the detail of that is in the book, but I look forward to Sean's ISQ article with great interest. Beyond that, I suppose the point about him not being opposed to utopianism, that's true. And I think his vision that political science is condemned to oscillate between realism and utopianism, this was mentioned by Maria before, it isn't an appealing vision. This idea that we're trapped in this kind of pendulum swing for perhaps the rest of history. As long as we have politics, we'll always be stuck in the oscillations. I find it neither convincing nor appealing. And so he, to that extent, I mean, but he is, you know, a self-professed utopian. I too would kind of say that part of the problem with the liberal utopianism of today, and this just recapitulates what Maria said, is the fact that it is in many ways insufficiently utopian, not least because it's so organically attached to American power in a way that it's oblivious to. Its presupposition is the American ability to enforce liberal international order. That's the presupposition, it seems to me, of many of the claims advanced by critical theorists, critical constructivists over the last 20, 30 years. And so insufficiently utopian, I mean, I would agree with that. And so that's something which I think we, you know, to that extent, I would take that as a criticism of our contemporary utopians.
Thanks so much, both. And just to add, Sean specifies that indeed Lukács didn't share the horror either. So the debate continues. But you already, of course, pushed the conversation in the direction where I wanted it to also reach eventually. I guess, you know, you probably would agree, and I probably Luke would as well, that the key task of the book is diagnostic rather than, you know, offering some kind of a programmatic, polished alternative. You try to steer pretty clear from getting sort of involved in the prescriptive politics that Carr himself also quite prominently failed at, as we've seen, I guess. But I think one still, on the one hand, you know, admires the way you are skeptical, you know, on the one hand of the revival of classical realism, right? You have criticism to issue for all corners. And you know, I just want to read out one quote, which I found particularly sort of juicy and colorful, where you say that this revival offers us a decaffeinated version in which the dangerous, disruptive elements, those of political power, the state, and political interests, have been extracted, leaving a more tepid brew, barely distinguishable from the proverbial liberal idealism, no less focused on cosmopolitanism, ethics, international cooperation. End of quote. Inevitably, we still run into this question of the question that Carr grapples with, you know, the relationship between ethics and politics. Which one is the function of and should be the function of the other? You call for being realism made more real in a way, right? What would then be the key feature still if we push you on this point of your version of prudent realism, which is to be, you know, pursued in this world that we have inherited and that we inhabit at the time we do? What would be, you know, if there are any more specific propositions for the role and rights of the strong and powerful and those contemporary have-nots in the international relations? And what would be the sort of role and rights of the strong vis-a-vis the weak? Because of course, you know, inevitably, as we all get socialized and introduced to Carr from different contexts and you know, starting points, mine would be the one that comes from the region that Carr justified the Soviet annexation about in the sort of interwar context. So you know, he saw basically Soviet claims on Poland, territorial claims, as legitimate, and also justified the annexation of the Baltic states in 1940, among, you know, other perhaps dubious morally dubious questions where I can't agree with him. But I'd be I'd be interested in, even though I know that it's not and can never be the full task of any single piece of work to really deliver on both in terms of a good diagnosis and then the Leninist question of what is to be done, but perhaps still speculating a little bit in that direction, if you may. Sure,
and thank you, Maria, for the question, because I think it's a hard one, but one that no author should be allowed to escape with a book like this. So thank you for raising it. It's true that the key task of the book is diagnostic rather than prescriptive. What I suppose my vision of the kind of political realism that I would like to kind of have put back on the agenda, and how it relates to those basic questions of political power with respect to the rights of the strong and the weak. I suppose I would say that that I think one of the lessons of our 20 years crisis and our liberal international order, such as it is that the weak have been betrayed by it. That seems to me that they, insofar as the weak have put their hopes, have vested their hopes in that order, its promises have proved illusory, and that they, to that extent, have been complicit in the kind of naivety that has been bred by it. I mean, if we think about all the people who have been betrayed by having put their hopes in, say, military intervention in their favor, the people of Syria or the people of Libya, or the Kurds, or say the Tamils in Sri Lanka, say, or the Kosovars who put their hope in the NATO intervention but are still kind of locked up in what's effectively a protectorate. So the national independence that they fought for in 1999 at the beginning of our 20 years crisis, they're still effectively denied to them despite being nominally independent. So it seems to me that the weak have suffered from their how far they've sought to realize their hopes through this particular model, and that political realism, I think, would serve them better as well. I suppose in the case of certain states, say, there's the old saying that the Kurds, the only friends of the Kurds are the mountains. I suppose that's a kind of a political realist account, rather than putting their hopes in the ability of outside powers to help them, or to resolve their conflicts for them, or to rely on them. I think that would be kind of the political realist lessons for the weak, is the need for their own political self-sufficiency and the need to rely on their own strength. And that seems to me eminently compatible with political realism, or at least the kind of political realism that I'd like to put forward. So a political realism that's rooted in the claims of mass politics, in the ideas of the autonomy of the political, the inescapability of politics, in our accounts of society, and in our ability to, and in the way in which we tackle our collective problems. And I suppose I'd seek to fuse Carr and James Burnham, who I quoted towards the end of the book, and his view of the significance of Machiavellian ideas for politics. And so I would stick with Carr insofar as I think we have no choice but to draw that line between politics and ethics, and that politics can't be collapsed into ethics, which has been one of the failures, again, of our 20 years crisis, and something which international relations theorists, I think, in their ethical theorizing in particular, are most guilty of. And that's something, that line has to be redrawn, that the standards of political life are not those of ethical life, which isn't to say that there aren't standards that we use in politics, and Carr was clear about that, but that nonetheless there has to be a line that is drawn between the two, and that ethics is a function of politics rather than vice versa. And that seems to me an inescapable conclusion of the last of our 20 years crisis of the last 20 years. And so to that extent, I would stick with Carr.
Thanks so much, Phil. And I should add an important qualification from Sean again, which is, to all our enlightenment, that Carr does condemn the USSR on occasion. His Stalinism is an invention by the likes of Berlin. He doesn't moralize about the USSR, but that's not to say he did support or condone it. So I think it's an important point to dig further up on. We do not currently seem to have any further questions. Luke, would you like to come in with a perhaps final round of comments, and then we wrap it up, because it's been a pretty intense session, particularly for our author. So, and we could go on for hours. That's also pretty much, without doubt.
Yeah, and it was great. Yeah, great having Sean's interventions there, because I think there is a kind of a three-way discussion. I think a sort of an ongoing one between myself, Phil, and Sean on this, and it's also since we're talking about classical realism here, there's a kind of a weird shifting balance of power where two of us will agree against the one, all three of us will disagree with each other. But I think it's a wonderful set of discussions to have. And I suppose, I just want to reiterate, how important it is to have these discussions. And I think, that one of the things I like about your work, Phil, is that you force us to think about things, and quite often those things are uncomfortable. And I think that's the value of the book as well, and also that you don't 100% agree with Carr. Actually, you've got quite a lot of disagreements with Carr, and I think where one of those major ones, and it does come out in the book quite strongly, is that Phil, you have a strong attachment to democracy. And Carr's is, shall we say, to be charitable, a little bit weaker on that issue, and that is a major difference, I think, between the two of you. And just coming off of Sean's point there as well, but we got to be careful about sort of labeling Carr as well. And I think he's right about Carr's view of the Soviet Union is actually very ambivalent, if not quite opposed to it, until I believe someone might be able to correct me on this, but the story goes that it's Stalingrad that convinces Carr that the Soviet Union is a potential negative dialectic, basically, to what he sees as kind of the failures of liberalism. And this sort of leads to him, and of course he isn't a Stalinist in that sense, but there's an element of, for want of a better phrase, of being a kind of a fellow traveller of totalitarianism and authoritarianism. And I think that is a danger, not just in, I don't think necessarily a danger just in IR, but in our society generally, of a kind of a malaise there, and a kind of an attraction towards authoritarian forms of government. And to kind of agree with Phil there when he was agreeing with me on the kind of the issue of the Second World War, is that the Nazis were not just nasty racists and murderers, but they also were deeply incompetent. And I think that's something. If there's a lesson from there are many lessons from the 20th century, but I think one of them is the complete and utter failure of totalitarianism. And I think it's something that that does need to be underscored. And unfortunately, Carr does kind of, as many people of his age did, kind of was rather starry-eyed about some of the of what totalitarianism had to offer. So I think that is a lesson we can draw. It's a lesson about not going down the Carr's road, but I think it's a lesson that we need in this as we move into the third 20 years crisis, 2020 to 2030. But anyway, I've thoroughly enjoyed discussing this, by the way, and congratulations on both books, Phil. And it's 2020 has been a good year for you, that's for sure.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks. Thank you so much, Luke, for all the comments and the feedback, because it's been tremendously useful for me. And thanks to everyone who managed to come along. Thanks again to Sean for his detailed questions. And I as much as I mean, obviously I enjoyed writing and publishing those two books. I still can't quite say 2020 was a good year given everything that happened, unfortunately. But I appreciate the sentiment, and thank you.
Well, thank you both very, very much, because it's been, just as the book has been, very trenchant, exciting, and you are all, of course, invited to check the book out. Now, I guess, the incentive is even more strongly there. The book for our students is electronically available as an ebook at our Templeman Library, and for all the others, please do take advantage of this this generosity of the publisher to buy it on discount. Thank you very much both for coming along to this talk. I already see from the background of Luke's that the morning is arising and arriving, and we've spent 2 really engaging hours. Thank you for the sort of silent yet very strong presence of Sean and the other questions that we received. It's been great, and I welcome everyone back for our next book talk, which will happen at the very end of March. And it will be specifically on the 31st of March, when my colleague here at BSIS, Dr. Ivangi Shawa, will be in conversation with Jonah Schulhofer-Wall from Leiden University to discuss his new book, Quagmire in Civil War, also published in 2020. So, stay tuned and watch this space. And to Phil and Luke, many, many thanks to you, and welcome back, everyone. Good afternoon.